5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Samantha had decided to return to her old family home after many years. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt the cold, damp air on her skin. The wooden floor creaked as she walked. There was no electricity because the house had been abandoned for years. So she began to look around the rooms with the pale light of the lantern in her hand. When she opened the door to her childhood bedroom, the old smell, a mixture of damp, dust and mold, washed over her like a wave. As the rain beat against the broken windows of Samantha's old family home, the sound of drops echoing through the house was lost in the silence. Abandoned for years, the house had become a place with crumbling plaster walls and cobwebs that even time was afraid to touch. When Samantha was little, the house had felt like a safe haven, but now every corner seemed a threat. Her bed was still where she remembered it, but the bedding was faded, eaten in places by mice. The slight humming in the attic made her think that the wind was moving through the house. But over time it became more constant, like a whisper. At first Samantha didn't want to frighten herself, thinking it was the wind, but the whispers wouldn't stop. It was so indistinct that it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. It was as if every wall of the house was breathing and talking. As the night wore on, a deep restlessness settled over Samantha. The whispers became clearer and clearer. Now the words were forming. "Do you hear me?" Suddenly Samantha gasped and dropped the lantern. Shaking with fear, she quickly managed to pick it up again, only to realize that something had appeared in the corner of the room out of the shadows. At first it looked like a natural part of the darkness, but it moved. She could not believe her eyes. The shadow was tall and humanoid, but its form was fluctuating, as if trying to mimic a human silhouette. "Who's there?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. All she heard in reply was a high-pitched, echoing whisper. "They called me, and I came." Samantha fell to the ground, terrified. The shadow began to move towards her, its movement slow but menacing. Samantha stumbled backwards, her back hitting the wall. What appeared to be a hand emerging from the shadow reached out for Samantha but stopped short of touching her. "What do you want?" Samantha cried out, tears streaming down her cheeks. The shadow was silent for a moment. Then he spoke in a voice that echoed from every corner of the room. "This house is mine now. Your mother called me, and she left. But she left me here." Samantha tried to remember her mother's face, but her mind seemed to reject the memory. "You're lying," she said, her voice sounding weaker. "Find the notebook. You will understand everything." Samantha went up to the attic, feeling like she was in the middle of a nightmare. The hatch was very heavy, but somehow she managed to open it. As she went upstairs, she knew the shadows were watching her. When she lifted the lid of the trunk, she found an old, yellowed, dusty notebook inside. The first few pages were filled with childhood fairy tales and her mother's daily notes. But as she turned the pages, she began to see dark prayers and strange symbols. On the last page, she saw a note in large letters, apparently written in a hurry. "I called him, but I couldn't send him back." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The shadow appeared once more. This time it was bigger, darker, and more menacing. It leaned over Samantha and whispered, "Either you release me or you are trapped here." Samantha had a hard time accepting that what she was experiencing was real, but deep down she knew it wasn't a dream. "How do I set you free?" she asked desperately. The shadow did not answer. It just disappeared into the darkness of the room. But all the while, high-pitched voices from the walls repeated rhythmically, "Give your blood or stay here." Samantha's hands trembled, clutching the notebook tightly. She could not take her eyes off the shadows. The shadow reappeared, floating in the darkness of the room. But this time, it was not just a silhouette. Its shape had become more defined, with long, skinny arms, claws tapering at the tips of its fingers, and facial features curving and shifting in places. It had become a mind-boggling creature. "Either you release me or you are trapped here," the shadow said, its voice echoing around the room and inside Samantha's mind. How do I release you?" Samantha asked, choking on the words. Slowly the shadow began to move around Samantha. It had no footsteps, but it was eerie enough to feel its presence. It was like a cold, sharp wind, penetrating deeper with each breath Samantha took. "Give me your blood," the shadow said, its voice high-pitched and echoing. But this time his words were not a command, but an agreement. Samantha's eyes widened. "My blood? No. This is madness," she exclaimed. But the shadow only gave a light laugh in reply. "When they called me, they paid a price inside this house. The only thing that can save you is your own blood. But don't be afraid. Just a few drops." The shadow's voice was trying to deceive Samantha with its deceptive calm. But Samantha's instinct screamed that this was not true. She opened the notebook again and quickly turned the pages. Each page was filled with another dark symbol. Finally, she found a ritual instruction. To send back the summoned beings, the blood of a descendant of the summoner is required. "No," Samantha shouted angrily. As she studied the pages of the notebook more carefully, it was not difficult to realize that a few drops of blood would not be enough. This was a ritual of sacrifice. The dark entity wanted Samantha's life. The shadow moved closer to Samantha. "You hesitate, but I know. In the end you will give in. Because you cannot escape from here. My voices echo through these walls night after night until you completely lose your mind." Samantha's mind was in turmoil. Her thoughts were muddled and her heart was pounding like crazy. If she stayed here, this entity would use her like a toy. But even if she escaped, it was certain that her spirit would haunt her. Her eyes fell on the notebook once more. She noticed the dried bloodstains on the edge of the pages. Now Samantha knew that this ritual had been done before. Her mother had summoned this being and offered her own blood. But the ritual must have been incomplete because she could not send it back. "No," Samantha said in a determined voice. Suddenly she stood up. The shadow had not expected such a reaction and backed away. It was as if he was impressed by this little challenge. "No," he said, his voice a mocking echo. "Or do you choose to stay here with me forever?" At that moment Samantha's eyes fell on an old mirror in the room. The mirror showed a blurred reflection of Samantha. But there was something strange about her reflection. Behind it, the figure of the shadow seemed to merge with its own form. Samantha's eyes saw the dark figure of the shadow in her own eyes. "This house has called you. But you know you can't get out of here," said the shadow. "Your salvation lies in my hands alone." With a moment of courage, Samantha picked up an old wooden toy lying on the floor and threw it at the mirror, breaking it. She quickly picked up a sharp piece of mirror on the floor. The shadow's voice became a high-pitched scream, but it did not disappear completely. Samantha cut her hand with the broken piece of the mirror and a few drops of blood dripped onto the floor. The blood began to move strangely on the wooden floor, as if a ritual circle was forming. Suddenly the shadow began to change shape, becoming larger and more ferocious. "This is not enough," he cried out. Samantha, with her remaining strength, sneered. "They called you here, and I will send you back." The next morning, Samantha's car was found in front of the abandoned house. The doors were open, empty inside. The house was once again silent. But at night, passers-by said they could hear whispers coming from inside the house. "Can you hear me?"